Welcome to SVM Hoopin. I'm sports editor Dan Waisner alongside assistant sports editor Christopher Heimerman. And we have reached the midway point of the winter basketball season. Just got through the tournaments, had some good results from the local teams. And today we're going to talk about some sleepers. Some of those teams that maybe they didn't win tournaments, but they performed well. And they look like maybe they're rounding into shape coming into the second half. Christopher, do you have one in mind to start out with?
Well, in a few weeks, we're going to hit regionals, and there are going to be a couple of teams that are going to sneak up on some teams, like you mentioned. And one team getting away from the holiday tournaments that I think could be flying below teams' radar is Polo on the boys' side. 8-3 overall, 1-1, took off the Christmas tournament season. But this is a team that I think can actually sneak up on some people. I think with the Geary twins graduating, I think it opened up some opportunities for people. You get like the Brady Bushmans, who maybe were hungry for the limelight a little bit. You see what happened with Chris Fritsch when he got an opportunity as a senior, and he seized the opportunity. I think you're seeing that a little bit over in Polo. And coming right out of the gates, they're going to get some big-time tests. They're going to see Aquin tomorrow night, who's 9-1, and sitting atop the NUIC East, right? And Aquin, meanwhile, just lost beat Newman 44-28 last night, and Polo sees Newman on Saturday. So I think that's going to be a little bit eye-opening.
The interesting thing is yesterday, Brad Bickett sent in a bunch of stuff for the Rock Falls Shootout on Saturday, and each coach had wrote comments and different stuff about their teams. And Matt Messer, the coach of Polo, he wrote that they lost a lot of scoring with the Geary twins, but this year they've come out, they're more balanced. They're spreading the ball around, they're scoring more under the hoop. And that leads to more consistent play, what you saw last year out of Polo is they have games where they put up a ton of points, and then the next game, against maybe even a worse team, they're scoring 45 just because the shots aren't falling. This year, the Marcos seem more balanced, which could lead to a longer run once you get in the NUIC East, which is tough, plus then into the regionals.
Yeah, and we touched on Newman, and you knew Newman was going to get by with balance. Coming into the season, they were a little bit of an unknown. They kind of got punched in the mouth by Aquin a little bit last night. And I got a kick out of Ray Sharp's comments when he sent in the stats saying, here's our stats after the giant egg last night. So he knows that wasn't the team that we saw in the first half of the season, so we'll see how they come back.
Well, Newman didn't adjust to defense last night. And, that's something that other teams are going to watch and going to see on film if they were scouting it. And Newman's going to see a lot of that the rest of the season unless they figure out a way to beat it.
Another team that I kind of like is Bureau Valley. Getting to a team that did, in fact, win a tournament. They won Erie, and they kind of stuck it to Orion a little bit, 51-39 in that finale. And Parker Newhoffen had yet another great game with 19 points. So I think the boys down to the south can do a little bit of damage as well.
Well, I think Newhoffen's been just under the radar completely, and he might be one of the better athletes in that class, that sophomore class. He came up last year as a freshman for the BV, put up some nice points, but the team was really struggling, so people weren't really noticing. But this year, he did it in football. He had a good football season. He's come out in basketball, putting up points. Three Rivers might see some upsets when BV comes to town. I think Newman and BV meet up next week, so that'll be an interesting test to see where they stand, because Newman's kind of positioned itself to be right there with Riverdale and a couple of other teams.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're the starting quarterback in football and you're doing this sort of thing, you're not going to be on the radar for long. So.
Yeah, well, and that was interesting because he was starting quarterback as a freshman.
Yeah.
And then, the Barnes kid came up, and so then Barnes got some playing time, but Newhoffen also did too. So they kind of have these two threats. Newhoffen could have probably put up big numbers too if he had played the whole season. So it'll be interesting how those two coexist in football next year. Newhoffen in basketball seems like he's the real deal, and he could have BV not only this year but the next couple years, get them back to where they were when Brad Bickett first took over that program at the beginning of the 2000s when they were going to state a couple years in a row there and get third place.
Sure. Speaking of Bickett, we all know Rock Falls boys hardly off the radar. We're eager to see what they can do in the second half. Any other guys' teams that you wanted to talk about?
No, but Oregon and Rock Falls are both sitting in interesting places.
Yeah.
Because they've got nice records, but they're sitting at the bottom of their conference.
And that beast of a conference.
It's just going to be rough. They could end up at the bottom, but still win a regional or go to a sectional.
Yeah. It
doesn't mean they're a bad team. It just means the conference is that good. So it'll be interesting how that plays out. Next week, Rock Falls and Oregon play each other. I think you got a real enticing matchup in the post with Armasca and Maury. Armasca was a kid we planned on having a big season. Maury we knew was consistent last year, but he's really stepped up to the plate, especially last week at the Newman tournament,
Mm-hmm.
and become, an all-area candidate, and if Oregon goes a long way, maybe a Player of the Year candidate.
Yeah, a sense of urgency for them coming out of the gates. They have Bago on Saturday, and then Rock Falls. I chatted with Quinn Virgil on New Year's Day, working on that Jesse McKinley feature, and he said, he is, in fact, urging his guys to not put a major emphasis on wins and losses in the record. It's all about how they show every night, whether they come out to play.
I mean, the only other boys team I would think about is Erie.
Mm-hmm.
And they've been good and then they've been bad. So
Yeah.
it's just hard to get a feel on them. I think they depend a lot on Jacob Johnston.
Mm-hmm.
So if teams defensively can do something and take him away,
Mm-hmm.
it's just going to be a matter if they can have that second scorer come up and hit a few shots to loosen things up a little bit.
Connor Saad had a 19-point, I
Yeah.
think it was a 19-point game last week. Usually we think of him as a defensive stopper and an athlete, but he'd be a fine second option. But you're right, they got to be able to look down the bench a little bit.
And that, that kind of segues into my girls' teams. I think Erie's a girls' team that could be a little bit of a sleeper. They're sitting at 12-5 right now.
Mm-hmm.
They've lost to the good teams.
Yeah.
So it's hard to say what they are because Prophetstown really laid the wood to them,
Yeah.
if I remember right.
Mm-hmm.
But they have the Russ sisters, they have the Colbert sisters. Lake and Minor's been strong.
Mm-hmm.
These are girls that had a lot of success in volleyball. We've seen that in the past with like the Rock Falls teams the last couple of years. They're good athletes, and they tend to get better as the season goes on. So
They expect to win.
yeah, and eventually they figure out the sport because volleyball and basketball are a lot different.
Mm-hmm.
Volleyball is bang, 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 bang. Basketball, the game's slower. The game's you've got to progress through it. You got to be patient. And volleyball's that time's not there to be patient. You got to score and just ride that momentum, and that doesn't happen in basketball quite the same way.
Yeah, a team that gave Erie, that Erie gave a bit of a test to is the Newman girls.
Mm-hmm.
And despite the fact that they're going to clash with P-Town tonight, a couple of undefeated teams in the Three Rivers, I still think that Newman remains a little bit under the radar.
Right.
Just because we knew what they were coming into last year when they had the massive struggles and they came on a little bit. This year they came out, like gangbusters, just 10-6 overall, but 6-0 in the league.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there's a lot of people waiting to see exactly what they are.
And they've kind of loaded up their schedule a little bit. They went to the State Farm, which is probably a little bit above their heads.
Yeah.
But they played those games. I think they went 1-3, if I remember right.
Yeah.
They played those games. Your overall record, it's nice to have a glittering one, but it's a matter of what you do at the end. So, if they end up somewhere around 500 or better, but end up winning a regional, it'll be worth it. It's going to be tough because they're going to be in 2A this year. You're going to have Riverdale. You're going to have some of those teams get filtered there. They could end up at it just depends how the regionals are. They could play like an Oregon in that regional, and that's going to be a tough task. So it'll be interesting to see. The other team I had marked down is sort of like on that bubble of being a team we've been watching, but also a team that you just don't know what they are yet, and that's Eastland.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're 13-5. They did okay at the Dixon tournament, but they ran into Oregon right away, got put into the consolation bracket, and went through there. I know they won the tournament before that, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
But they're sitting in that 1A, which is really interesting because you got two just juggernauts in Aquin and Prophetstown who seem to be on that collision course.
Mm-hmm.
But if either of those teams overlook Eastland, I think they're going to be in trouble.
Yeah, without a doubt. That's the last team on my list, too. Lots of upperclassmen,
Mm-hmm.
and then you got the super sophomore Alexis McCumber coming on strong. And I think a good way to stay off people's radars is by playing in a tournament like the Dixon
Mm-hmm.
tournament, similar to Newman playing in the State Farm, where you're going to take some lumps.
Yeah.
And people who might not be educated on the field you're in might see you losing some games and might consider that vulnerability. But I think, again, Eastland can get tougher because of that. And I think I've only been here, I'm running out of this excuse, but a little bit over a year, so I haven't been here for a lot of the seasons. But it seems like the Eastland boys under Tony Dunlap, perhaps the girls sometimes get overshadowed.
Mm-hmm.
But if either team doesn't have the Eastland boys or girls on their radar, they need to get their radar fixed because they look pretty good.
Well, it's interesting because you have really two similar coaches in Dunlap and Colin Finhenzy there. I mean, Eastland has had a few down years here, but there was a time when, when I first started here, they were playing Newman in sectional championship games in the two-class system, which was 1A. It would have been 1A, and they were pushing Newman's team. We had Jocelyn Mellon, who was a Division I recruit, and Aubrey Parsons, who was also a very good player. But Newman didn't run over him, and so Colleen Finhenzy's very much the same way. She's a drill sergeant. She's that kind of person, like Tony Dunlap, who doesn't take a lot of stuff, but they always seem to get those teams playing at their very best, even when they don't have the greatest talent. They always seem like they end up around 500,
Yeah.
and then they get into a regional, and they may or may not make noise. I think this year you might see them make some noise.
On both sides, boys and girls.
Oh yeah, well, Eastland's not under the radar on the boys' side.
Yeah, that's true.
They've got.
I forgot the subject of our video.
they've got a lot of expectations on them, and that's a hard thing for high school athletes to handle. Also, is living up to those expectations, and that's what makes this exciting. We'll see. We're in the heart of conference races now. Mm-hmm. We'll see if in Eastland and Newman and Propstown, some of these teams, if they can compete in that conference before they worry about regionals, and it'll be exciting.
Well, we continue to try to live up to your expectations of our sports department. Check out all the stories at SaukValley.com. Brian Weidman caught up with Stefan Adamez. I believe that story is going to be going live. We'll see lots of video and print coverage from him on the wrestling beat. And hope everybody had a great holiday season. Happy New Year. And we're very happy as we get into the second half of hoops. This is where it gets exciting.
Yep. We'll see you at the games.